In a quiet suburb of Seattle, Washington, on Maple Street, stood the two-story home of the Anderson family. David Anderson, a 42-year-old middle manager at a large tech company, lived here with his wife Sarah, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher. Their marriage had lasted 15 years, and from the outside, they appeared to be a typical American middle-class family. David was a tall man with dark hair and brown eyes, known among colleagues for his hard work and ambition. He always strived for career advancement and spent a lot of time at work. Sarah, a petite blonde with blue eyes, was beloved by her students for her kindness and patience. She devoted most of her free time to lesson preparation and participation in school events. In the neighboring house lived Sarah's mother, Elizabeth Thompson, a 58-year-old widow. After her husband's death 3 years ago, she moved closer to her daughter. Elizabeth was an attractive woman who had maintained a slim figure and elegance. She worked as a real estate agent and had a reputation as a successful professional in her field. Neighbors often saw David helping Elizabeth with household chores, fixing the roof, mowing the lawn, or just visiting. No one suspected that behind these innocent visits lay something more. The Andersons had no children, which became a subject of discussion among acquaintances. Sarah had always dreamed of a large family, but David seemed not to share her enthusiasm. This became a source of growing tension in their relationship. In the town, everyone knew each other, and the Anderson family was respected. David was a member of the local golf club, Sarah participated in charity events, and Elizabeth often organized neighborhood watch programs to ensure the safety of the area. No one could have guessed that behind the facade of this prosperous life lay a terrible secret that would lead to a tragedy that would shake the entire city. The events that unfolded in the house on Maple Street would become a subject of discussion for years to come, making people wonder how well we really know those who live next to us. It all began in June 2022, when David Anderson took on the responsibility of helping Elizabeth Thompson with repairs to her house. Sarah was busy preparing for the summer school camp and gratefully accepted her husband's initiative to help her mother. David began spending evenings and weekends at Elizabeth's house, working on roof repairs, painting walls, and updating plumbing. Gradually, these meetings began to go beyond simple household assistance. Elizabeth, feeling lonely after her husband's death, found comfort and support in her conversations with David. Their conversations became increasingly personal. David shared with Elizabeth his career ambitions and disappointment in his married life. He confessed that he felt misunderstood by Sarah, who, in his opinion, was too focused on the idea of having children. Elizabeth, in turn, talked about her loneliness and the difficulties of life as a widow. In early August, during a particularly hot evening when David was helping Elizabeth sort through things in the attic, the first physical contact occurred between them. It started with an accidental touch that turned into an embrace, and then into a passionate kiss. Both were shocked by their actions but couldn't resist the sudden attraction. After this incident, David and Elizabeth tried to avoid each other for several days, feeling guilty and embarrassed. However, they soon realized that they couldn't resist their feelings. They began meeting secretly, using work on the house as a cover. Their affair developed rapidly. David found in Elizabeth the passion and understanding that he felt was lacking in his marriage to Sarah. Elizabeth, in turn, felt young and desirable again with David. They began to look for any opportunity to meet. David started staying late at work, telling Sarah he had important projects. Elizabeth invented reasons to invite David to help her with various household tasks. They even started meeting at a hotel on the outskirts of town to avoid suspicion. Despite feeling guilty, especially towards Sarah, neither David or Elizabeth could end their relationship. They convinced themselves that their love was special and that they deserved this happiness, despite the circumstances. By the end of the year, their connection had become an integral part of their lives. They exchanged secret messages using encrypted apps and planned their future together. David even began to think about divorcing Sarah, although he didn't dare to discuss it directly. Meanwhile, Sarah, immersed in her work and dreams of children, suspected nothing of what was happening right under her nose. She attributed her husband's distance to stress at work and was grateful for his help to her mother. However, as often happens with forbidden romances, David and Elizabeth underestimated the risks of their actions and didn't realize how close they had come to the edge of an abyss that would soon engulf them all. By the beginning of 2023, the atmosphere in the Anderson home had noticeably changed. David was staying late at work more often and appeared distracted when he was at home. Sarah, feeling the growing distance between them, tried to restore closeness in their relationship. In February, Sarah suggested going on a romantic trip for Valentine's Day, but David refused, citing an important work project. This became a turning point for Sarah, who began to suspect that something was wrong in their marriage. Sarah began to pay closer attention to her husband's behavior. She noticed that David had started changing his phone password more frequently and always kept it with him. When she tried to discuss their relationship with him, David became irritable and avoided the conversation. In March, Sarah turned to her best friend, Jessica, for advice. Jessica suggested that David might be having an affair, but Sarah refused to believe it. Nevertheless, the seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, David and Elizabeth's relationship was becoming more intense. They began planning a future together, discussing the possibility of moving to another city where no one knew them. However, they both understood that realizing these plans would inevitably cause pain to Sarah. In April, Sarah decided to surprise David by bringing him lunch at work. To her surprise, his colleagues informed her that David had taken the day off. When she called him, he lied, saying he was in an important meeting with a client. This incident intensified Sarah's suspicions. Tension in the family grew. Sarah became more insistent in her attempts to find out what was happening. She began checking David's accounts, looking for traces of unusual expenses or suspicious activity. David, feeling the growing pressure, became even more secretive and irritable. In May, Sarah suggested seeing a family therapist, but David categorically refused. This led to a major argument, during which Sarah openly accused her husband of infidelity for the first time. David vehemently denied the accusations, but his reaction only strengthened Sarah's suspicions. Elizabeth, observing the growing tension between her daughter and son-in-law, began to feel a strong sense of guilt. She understood that her affair with David was ruining Sarah's life, but couldn't find the strength to end the relationship. By the end of May, the situation had reached a critical point. Sarah, tormented by suspicion and constant arguments, decided to conduct her own investigation. She installed a spy app on David's phone, hoping to find evidence of his infidelity. David, feeling the noose tightening around him, became more careless in his actions. He began to take more risks, meeting Elizabeth even when the chance of being caught was high. Elizabeth, in turn, began to think about confessing everything to her daughter. The burden of secrecy was becoming unbearable, and she feared that the truth, if not revealed by her, would cause Sarah even greater pain. June began with anxious anticipation. All three participants in this love triangle felt that the denouement was near. But none of them could have predicted how tragic the consequences of their actions would be. June 15, 2023 became the day when David and Elizabeth's carefully guarded secret was revealed. Sarah, tormented by suspicions, decided to check the data from the spy app installed on her husband's phone. What she discovered shocked her: dozens of intimate messages between David and her mother. Sarah was stunned and devastated. She couldn't believe that the two people closest to her could have so cruelly betrayed her trust. In a state of emotional shock, she called her friend Jessica, who immediately came over to support her. Sarah spent the entire day rereading the messages, trying to comprehend the scale of the betrayal. She learned that the affair had been going on for almost a year, and that David and Elizabeth had been discussing plans for a future together. This discovery broke Sarah's heart completely. In the evening, when David returned home, Sarah was ready for a confrontation. As soon as he crossed the threshold, she threw the phone at him with the open messages. David turned pale, realizing that his secret had been exposed. A violent argument followed. Sarah screamed, accusing David of betrayal and lies. She demanded explanations, asking how he could do this to her, and with her mother no less. David, caught off guard, tried to justify himself, talking about problems in their marriage and how he felt misunderstood and unloved. In the heat of the argument, Sarah called her mother and demanded that she come over immediately. Elizabeth, realizing that their secret had been exposed, headed to her daughter's house with a heavy heart. When Elizabeth entered, the atmosphere became even more heated. Sarah unleashed a torrent of accusations and reproaches at her mother. Elizabeth, broken by guilt, tried to explain her actions, speaking of loneliness and the need for closeness after her husband's death. But her words only intensified Sarah's anger. David, trying to calm the situation, suggested that they all sit down and calmly discuss what had happened. But Sarah was too angry for a rational conversation. She demanded that David immediately pack his things and leave the house. At this moment, Elizabeth, trying to protect David, made a fatal admission. She said that she loved him and that they had been planning to start a new life together. These words were the last straw for Sarah. In a fit of rage, Sarah grabbed a vase and threw it towards her mother and husband. The vase shattered against the wall, fragments scattering across the room. This act of violence made everyone fall silent. An oppressive silence fell. Sarah, realizing what she had just done, burst into tears and ran out of the room. David and Elizabeth were left standing, shocked and not knowing what to do next. This evening became a turning point for all three. Their lives would never be the same again. Sarah locked herself in the bedroom, refusing to come out or talk to anyone. David, obeying Sarah's demand, packed the most necessary things and left, staying at a local motel. Elizabeth, broken by guilt and shame, returned to her house, not knowing if she would ever be able to restore her relationship with her daughter. None of them could have guessed that this was only the beginning of a tragedy that would soon shock their small town and change their lives forever. Over the next week, tension between the three participants in this drama continued to escalate. Sarah, plunged into deep depression, took leave from school and hardly left the house. David, living in a motel, tried to contact her, but all his calls and messages went unanswered. Elizabeth, tormented by guilt, didn't dare approach her daughter's house. On June 22nd, a week after the secret was revealed, an event occurred that would forever change the lives of all those involved in this story. On the evening of that day, Sarah unexpectedly appeared on her mother's doorstep. Elizabeth, seeing her daughter, was simultaneously relieved and frightened. Neighbors later told the police that they heard loud screams coming from Elizabeth's house. After about an hour, the screams subsided, and Sarah came out of the house. She got into her car and drove away. The next morning, when Elizabeth didn't show up for work, her colleagues became worried and called the police. The officers who arrived at the scene discovered a horrifying sight: Elizabeth Thompson's body lay in the living room. Medical examiners later determined that death had occurred from multiple blows to the head with a heavy object. News of Elizabeth Thompson's murder quickly spread through the town, causing shock and disbelief. The police immediately began an investigation. The main suspects were Sarah and David Anderson. David was detained for questioning that same day. He was shocked by the news of Elizabeth's death and categorically denied any involvement in the murder. He told the police about the revelation of their affair and that he hadn't seen Elizabeth since the confrontation a week ago. Sarah had disappeared. Her phone was turned off, and her car was found abandoned in a parking lot near the bus station. The police issued a search warrant for her. During the investigation, evidence was found pointing to Sarah's involvement in the murder. Elizabeth's house contained Sarah's fingerprints, as well as traces of her DNA on the murder weapon, a marble statuette that Sarah had once given to her mother. 3 days after the murder, Sarah turned herself in to the police. She looked exhausted and depressed. During questioning, she confessed to killing her mother, saying that she had come to talk to her, but the conversation had escalated into a fierce argument. In a fit of rage, Sarah grabbed the statuette and struck her mother several times. The arrest of Sarah Anderson, a respected elementary school teacher, shocked the entire town. Many couldn't believe that this kind and gentle woman was capable of such a brutal crime. David, although cleared of suspicion in the murder, became the object of public condemnation. Many believed that his actions had led to this tragedy. Unable to withstand the pressure, he resigned from his job and left town. The murder of Elizabeth Thompson and the arrest of Sarah Anderson became the main news story not only in their town but throughout the state. This story of love, betrayal, and murder shocked the public, making many people think about the fragility of family relationships and the destructive power of jealousy and resentment. The town continued to discuss this tragedy for a long time, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet suburb among people they considered their good neighbors. Over the next few weeks, the Seattle police conducted a thorough investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Thompson. Despite Sarah's confession, detectives had to gather all possible evidence to ensure a fair trial. Detective Michael Ramirez, leading the investigation, began with a detailed examination of the crime scene. Forensic experts found numerous signs of struggle in Elizabeth's living room. Blood analysis on the statuette confirmed that it was the murder weapon. Fingerprints on the statuette matched Sarah's. Investigators also seized Elizabeth's computer and phone. Analysis of electronic correspondence revealed numerous intimate messages between Elizabeth and David, confirming their long-term affair. These messages became key evidence explaining the motive for the crime. Questioning the neighbors provided additional details. Several people confirmed seeing Sarah's car near Elizabeth's house on the evening of the murder. One neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, said she heard a loud argument and the sound of breaking glass about an hour before the presumed time of the murder. David Anderson was questioned again. Although he was not a suspect in the murder, his testimony was important for establishing a complete picture of events. David told about the development of his relationship with Elizabeth, their plans to start a new life together, and how Sarah found out about their affair. His testimony helped the investigation better understand Sarah's emotional state before committing the crime. The psychologist who worked with Sarah after her arrest provided his conclusion. He described her condition as an acute reaction to stress and betrayal, which led to a temporary mental breakdown. This conclusion became an important factor in determining Sarah's sanity at the time of committing the crime. Analysis of David and Elizabeth's financial documents showed that they were indeed planning a future together. Evidence was found that they were looking for a house to buy in another state and had opened a joint bank account. Investigators also studied the past of all participants in the drama. They discovered that Sarah had undergone treatment for depression after several unsuccessful attempts to get pregnant. This added a new layer to understanding her emotional state. An important stage of the investigation was the analysis of surveillance camera footage. Recordings from cameras of neighboring houses showed Sarah's car arriving at Elizabeth's house and leaving an hour later. These frames became irrefutable evidence of Sarah's presence at the crime scene. As the investigation progressed, Detective Ramirez became increasingly convinced that the murder was committed in a state of affect, rather than being a premeditated act. The lack of evidence of prior planning and Sarah's emotional state indicated that this was a crime of passion. A month after the start of the investigation, the Seattle police officially completed the collection of evidence. The case was transferred to the prosecutor's office for preparation for trial. Sarah Anderson was officially charged with second-degree murder. This investigation became one of the most discussed in the city's history. It not only revealed the details of a tragic event but also raised important questions about the complexity of human relationships and the destructive power of jealousy and betrayal. The trial of Sarah Anderson began on September 15, 2023, and attracted attention throughout the state of Washington. The King County Courthouse was packed. Journalists, local residents, and lawyers all wanted to see how this tragic story would end. State Prosecutor Jonathan Berger, in his opening statement, painted a picture of premeditated murder. He argued that Sarah, upon learning of her husband's and mother's betrayal, purposefully went to Elizabeth's house with the intention of revenge. Berger emphasized the brutality of the crime, describing the multiple blows inflicted on the victim. Sarah's lawyer, Maria Rodriguez, presented a different version of events. She described her client as a victim of circumstances, a woman driven to despair by the betrayal of the two people closest to her. Rodriguez insisted that the murder was committed in a state of affect and was not premeditated. Over 2 weeks, the court heard testimony from numerous witnesses. David Anderson, called as a prosecution witness, looked exhausted and depressed. His testimony about the affair with Elizabeth and Sarah's reaction to the revelation of their relationship became key to understanding the motive for the crime. Elizabeth's neighbors told what they heard on the evening of the murder. Their testimony confirmed that a fierce argument had occurred between Sarah and Elizabeth before the latter's death. Forensic experts presented a detailed analysis of the crime scene, confirming the spontaneous nature of the murder. The lack of preparation traces and the nature of the inflicted blows indicated that the crime was committed in a fit of rage. The psychiatrist who worked with Sarah after her arrest testified about her mental state. He described deep depression and post-traumatic stress disorder that Sarah experienced after discovering the infidelity. The culmination of the process was Sarah's own testimony. She took the witness stand looking pale and haggard. Sarah told the court about how she discovered the betrayal, about her emotional state in the days leading up to the murder. She admitted that she went to her mother to talk, but the conversation escalated into a fierce argument. Sarah described how, in a moment of rage, she grabbed the statuette and struck, not fully aware of her actions. Her emotional testimony made a strong impression on the jury and the public. Many in the courtroom couldn't hold back tears while listening to her story. After closing arguments from both sides, the jury retired to deliberate. The discussion lasted 2 days, indicating the complexity of the case and differences in the jurors' opinions. On September 20, 2023, the court assembled for the verdict announcement. The room fell silent in anticipation. The jury foreman read the decision. Sarah Anderson was found guilty of manslaughter, not second-degree murder as the prosecution had insisted. Judge Robert Wilson, taking into account all the circumstances of the case and the jury's recommendations, handed down the sentence 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. Additionally, the judge ordered that Sarah must undergo mandatory psychological rehabilitation during her incarceration. The announcement of the sentence caused mixed reactions in the courtroom and beyond. Some considered the sentence too lenient, given the severity of the crime. Others saw it as a fair decision, taking into account all the circumstances of the tragedy. Sarah, upon hearing the sentence, burst into tears. Her lawyer announced that they would not appeal, acknowledging the fairness of the court's decision. This trial became one of the most discussed in the state's history, raising important questions about the nature of crimes of passion and how the justice system should respond to such complex cases.